The day my parents sat me down and told me they were getting a divorce, my whole world turned upside down. I was only 12 years old, and I couldn't even imagine that something like that was possible. To my child's understanding, divorces were something distant and foreign, an event that happened only to those who constantly argued, to those who yelled at each other, slammed doors, and caused scenes. But my parents? They were never like that. Their relationship was smooth, like a quiet river, always polite, always restrained. We hadn't gone on a family outing in a long time, but I thought it was just because they were too busy. I remembered how, over the years, joint dinners became rarer and how I often found myself alone, but I was always told it was just a temporary difficulty. When my mom said those words, I felt a strange emotion. Her voice was remarkably calm, too calm, almost lifeless. That feeling of emptiness struck me right from the start. She said, "Candy, your dad and we need to talk." I looked at them, sitting on the couch, at such a strange, almost formal distance from each other, as if there was an invisible barrier between them that they both adhered to. I felt something inside me start to collapse. Mom didn't look at me, she spoke into the emptiness, and her voice carried such weariness, as if she had already accepted this as an inevitable fact, while I was still trying to understand what was happening. Dad cleared his throat, as always, before saying something important. His words came out so dry, as if it were news about something trivial, something not worth any attention. "We've decided to get a divorce," he said, as if announcing that we were having pizza for dinner. I was so stunned that I couldn't say anything. I couldn't even process what had just happened. I needed more time to grasp his words, more time to understand that this day would mark the beginning of a change in my life forever. I blinked several times, trying to squeeze out at least one question, but nothing came. I was waiting for the final phrase, the one that should somehow justify everything that was happening. But it never came. All I could say was, "But why?" Those words escaped me like a lone cry in the void. Mom reached out and patted my hand as if to comfort me, but there was none of the usual warmth in her gesture that she always gave me. "Sometimes people grow apart, sweetie," she said, as if those words could somehow soothe me. I felt as though she didn't believe what she was saying. "Your dad and I found other people we want to be with," she added, and there was such weariness in her voice that it made everything even harder to bear. Dad nodded, and his face remained impassive. "I'll move out soon," he said. "You'll live with Mom, but sometimes you'll—" He didn't finish his sentence, but I no longer expected him to. All I needed to understand was that my life would never be the same again. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Every corner seemed unfamiliar, every sound felt alien, and every face was distant. This was the very room where I had grown up, where every item reminded me of something familiar, but now it felt as though I was standing among other people's things, in a house that had stopped being a home. The next day, everything got worse. I came home from school, and the first thing I noticed was the twins wearing my clothes. Their laughter echoed down the hallway, and I, still not understanding what was going on, froze in place. "Hey!" I said in shock. In response, Kiara rolled her eyes, clearly ignoring my question. "Mom said we could borrow them," she replied with a slight hint of irritation, pulling my favorite t-shirt out of my closet. "Don't be such a selfish person," she added, and I felt the weight of it all pressed down even harder. I looked at my mom, who was standing in the doorway, searching for my support. But her face was calm, almost carefree. She smiled, as if unaware of how my world was falling apart. "Sharing candy is now a concern," she said, and I wanted to scream. She continued, "The girls just want to feel wanted." Those words seemed to pierce me like cold needles, leaving the feeling that I had been deprived of something important, something invisible had been taken away, and I couldn't stop it. The twins were wearing my favorite shirt, and the fact felt so personal, so painful. I stumped off to my room, trying not to cry, even though the tears were always at the edge of my consciousness. No matter how hard I tried to hold it together, I understood that I was becoming a stranger here. In the house. In the family. In my life. Mom no longer paid attention to me, to my feelings, to my habits. She was completely absorbed by the twins. They were becoming the center of her world, her care, and her love. Days passed, and it became more and more obvious that I was no longer the most important person. There was no longer that admiration in her eyes, that care that had been there before. My things, when I forgot them in plain sight, started to disappear. I would find my old toys, books, and clothes in Kiara or Lisa's closet, and each time my heart would tighten with pain. She was giving away my things without my permission, as though I didn't exist for her. I tried to talk to her, to ask why, but she would only shrug and say that the girls need more. More of what? My things? My attention? One day, when I came home, I overheard her conversation with her new husband. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, as usual, talking about something important, and her voice was full of confidence, almost calm efficiency. I stood behind the door, not daring to enter, but the words of their conversation pierced through to me despite the distance. Girls need new phones, she said. We could use the money we set aside for Sophia's birthday, she added. I froze, rooted to the spot. Birthday? My birthday, which she spoke of so casually, planning to skip. I felt everything inside me snap. I had expected that, for her, my birthday would still be important, that she would at least pretend to remember. But there was no regret or confusion in her voice, only cold, indifferent businesslike efficiency. I stood behind the door, and something inside me broke completely. My stepfather's face darkened, as if clouds had gathered above his head, ready to burst into a storm. He didn't say a word, his gaze was cold and relentless, like steel. In that moment, I realized that he wasn't just angry, he was set on something I couldn't change. Grabbing me by the arm, he dragged me to a small storage room at the end of the hallway. It was dark, musty, filled with old boxes and forgotten junk that had once been important but now meant nothing. I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong, his steps too certain. He opened the door, shoved me inside, and I realized that this wasn't just a punishment, it was a place where I was supposed to learn to be different, to become someone else. You'll stay here until you learn to control your temper, he said, and the door slammed shut with a bang. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. It all happened so fast that I barely had time to grasp what had occurred. I hadn't done anything to deserve such cruelty, but this was exactly what he had chosen for me. I cried, but my stepfather no longer heard me. He left me in the dark, like I was in some nightmare with no way out. I heard giggling behind the door. It was the twins. Their laughter was unpleasant, sinister, as if they knew what was going to happen to me. Hey, Sophia. The sounds came from behind the door, and I curled into a corner, trying to shut out everything that was happening around me. One of them, I think, called themselves Through the Forest. They knew I was afraid of the dark. They knew the room was full of spiders, big, hairy ones that crawled out at night when no one was watching. I tried to hide in the corner, not giving in to panic, even though I was on the verge of breaking down. I understood they were lying, that there were no spiders in the room, but the fear still gripped my chest, making my heart race faster. Every sound felt terrifying, every movement in the dark seemed like a threat. I heard something rustling in the corner, as though someone was sneaking up on me, but I couldn't do anything about it. All I could do was sit there, cross-legged, hugging my knees, trying not to think about what could happen. The hours stretched on endlessly. It felt like I wasn't even breathing. Time became foggy, and I couldn't tell whether minutes or an eternity had passed. No one moved outside the door, no one came to check on me. Even Mom, whom I had hoped to see, didn't come. She didn't come to rescue me. She was nearby, but she didn't see me. That was the most painful realization, that, for her, I no longer existed as I once had. When the door finally opened, it was morning. The light from the hallway was bright and painful. Mom stood there, tired, her eyes red from sleep, her hair disheveled. She looked as if she had been through the entire night, but her gaze was empty, not meeting mine. She didn't say a word, just stood there like a shadow, not understanding what I was feeling. My frozen tears, my pain, were invisible to her, as if I didn't even exist. In the weeks that followed, as I settled into my new life, I began to understand that I could move forward, despite everything I had been through. Aunt Sarah and Uncle Tom didn't just care for me, they became something more. They didn't just make sure I ate, slept, and studied, they became my guardians in the truest sense of the word. They asked about my day, helped with homework, and, most importantly, they really listened when I spoke. Their gaze held none of the indifference I had often encountered at home. It was something new, warm, and real. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Uncle Tom, with his ever-kind but slightly thoughtful expression, suddenly asked, "Sophia, how should we address each other now?" He looked at me with curiosity, as if he genuinely cared about my answer. "We're officially your guardians now," he added, as though explaining that their relationship with me was not just about obligation but real respect. I paused for a moment, trying to understand what these people had given me over these few weeks. They had given me more care and attention than my parents had in all the years. "Can I call you Mom and Dad?" I asked hesitantly, my voice trembling with embarrassment. The words came out almost without thinking. I knew this was a moment that would change everything. Aunt Sarah's eyes filled with tears for a moment, and I felt her hand gently rest on mine. "Oh, sweetie," she said with such warmth that I felt something melt in my chest. "From this day on, we'll be proud to be your mom and dad. We'll always be with you." It was the acknowledgement I had longed for but never could have expected. They didn't just care for me, they truly wanted to be a part of my life. With each passing day, my biological parents became more and more distant memories, people I once knew but now thought of less and less. I couldn't imagine them returning to my life. They had left me in that empty house, and now I was part of something else. My new life wasn't just about Aunt Sarah and Uncle Tom. I began to realize it was also about new people, new connections, which could be strong, real, and maybe even better. I also got to know Uncle Tom's mother, my grandmother, who was a woman of strength but also kindness, with eyes full of wisdom. She helped me cope with my inner turmoil, making sure I felt calmer in this new home. Her gentle kindness was like a quiet island in the ocean of change. When I finally answered one of those calls, I almost dropped the receiver in shock. "Candy, hi, it's your mom," the voice I hadn't heard in years pierced my ears, something both foreign and familiar. It was the same as I remembered it, but with a painful edge, as if time had worn it down, making it harsh and cold. Before I could respond, she hurried to continue. "I've been thinking about you so much lately. How are you? Where are you studying? We need to catch up." I stood there, stunned, as if in a fog, not knowing what to say or how to react to this sudden interest that seemed so artificially created, as if she were trying to convince me of something she didn't believe herself. Over the next few days, similar calls came from my biological father. Suddenly, they both started showing intense interest in my life, offering to meet up, talking about how much they missed me. It all sounded awkward, a bit clumsy, and, frankly, suspicious. They were trying to reinsert themselves into my life as though nothing had changed, as if the years spent away from me had left no mark. But it was hard to believe their words when I knew that in those very years, when I needed their support the most, they had done nothing to earn my trust. I told Aunt Sarah and Uncle Tom everything. We were sitting at dinner when I confessed to them what had happened. I didn't expect the reaction to be so strong. One evening, during our usual dinner, when Aunt Sarah had served me a portion of potatoes and looked at me with a slight concern, I said, "Mom and Dad have started calling again. They want to see me." They say they miss me." To my surprise, Aunt Sarah burst into loud laughter. She laughed so hard that her laughter, like a string, filled the whole kitchen, cutting through the silence. "Oh, Candy," she said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes, "I hate to say it, but I think they might have gotten wind of your inheritance." Those words, spoken without a hint of malice but with a soft, uneasy undertone, instantly sobered me up. There was no anger in her voice, just bitterness and a barely perceptible regret about how things had turned out. Part of me, the part that still hoped for something good, wanted to ignore these calls, pretend I had never received them. I wanted to close my eyes, forget about their existence like a bad dream, so as not to shatter the little illusion that remained. But the other part, the part that had long lost faith in my parents' words, understood that now was not the time for weakness. I couldn't afford to go back to that world that had once destroyed me. She opened and closed her mouth several times, looking like a fish out of water, not knowing what to say. I watched her with cold curiosity as she tried to find the words. "Well, I mean, it was so long ago." Her voice trembled, and her eyes avoided my gaze. I knew she had no idea about my life, about what had happened to me over the years. She didn't know about my accomplishments, my struggles, or how I had learned to survive in a world where no one cared to understand me. All she knew was that I now had money, that I had become part of their scheme, part of something they could use. My version of everything that had happened was completely confirmed. I felt something inside me freeze. My body was tense, and my thoughts were clearer than ever. I stood up. Suddenly, my chair creaked across the floor, breaking the silence, and I couldn't hold back everything that had been building inside me. "I think I know why you invited me here," I said, and my voice sounded surprisingly calm, almost emotionless. "This is about my inheritance, isn't it?" I asked, almost testing them, as if waiting for them to admit it themselves. The room immediately became silent. I saw my stepfather's face turn red with anger and shame, while the twins suddenly became extremely interested in their plates, as if they had just noticed how much food was on them. "How can you say that?" my mother gasped, her voice faltering, but her eyes gave her away. There was not the slightest hint of maternal love or care in them. All I saw in her gaze was cold calculation, the desire to manipulate, to control me, to take advantage of what she considered her right. Disappointment, that's what was in her eyes. It wasn't pain for the lost daughter, but disappointment that I no longer played by their rules. "Now, Candy," my stepfather began, his voice low and threatening, as though he was about to put everything back in its place. But I didn't let him finish. I interrupted him, unwilling to listen to any more of their empty excuses and lies. "No, I'm done here. Don't call me again," I said, and with those words, I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but I walked confidently, and even though emotions still raged inside me, I knew I had made the right choice. With that, I stepped into the cool night air, leaving behind not only their angry shouts but my entire past. I felt everything that had been holding me slip away, as though I were shedding old chains. I didn't need their approval or their love. I had other people, other relationships, more genuine and real than anything I had ever experienced in this family. I was ready to move on, and nothing could stop me. I laughed, and my laugh was almost cruel, as if all the pent-up emotions were bursting out in this single, piercing sound. "Actually," I said, standing, "according to the law, you're not even my family." I felt how this acknowledgement filled the air, how it both scared and liberated me. "You abandoned me, remember? Aunt Sarah and Uncle Tom are now my legal parents." Those words sounded like a sentence, and I was surprised to realize that, although I spoke them firmly, I felt no emotion inside. I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel a thirst for revenge, just emptiness, which I had filled with new people who truly cared about my happiness. When I stepped out the door, I heard my stepmother's piercing voice, her panicked questioning, the angry shouts of my father. But I didn't look back. I moved forward, not stopping. I got into the car and drove away, feeling a strange mix of emotions, sadness, anger, but more than anything, relief. It was the feeling I had lacked all these years, the relief of no longer having to live in the shadow of their decisions, their expectations, and their demands. In the days following my visits to my biological parents, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls, text messages, voicemails, everything flooded my day, making it heavy and unbearably tense. Messages came one after another, each sounding like a desperate attempt to bring me back. I heard my mother's voice, which, even through text messages, reached me with its subtle reproach and complaint. "We're going to lose the house soon, we'll be on the street. Don't you care?" It was exactly as I had expected. All they cared about were their own problems. And I was just a tool in their calculations. My father's approaches ranged from attempts to make me feel guilty to outright demands, as if everything I had been through was merely a weak excuse for him. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us," he shouted in one of the voice messages. I turned off the phone, set it aside, and didn't respond anymore. My silence was the greatest punishment for them. Instead of wasting energy on their meaningless manipulations, I focused on myself. I immersed myself in my studies, absorbing each lesson and assignment with renewed determination, as if that were the only reality that mattered. My final year in college became the time when I finally understood what truly mattered to me. Not family, not money, not recognition. I started moving forward, freeing myself from the chains of the past and building my own life, one where there was no longer room for those who had used me.